What if the quiet, gnawing fear that we have somehow missed our window in life is not a sign of spiritual failure, but simply a sign that we are deeply, profoundly exhausted from trying to hold our own world together? It is often in the dead of night when this feeling strikes the hardest. The house is completely silent. The rest of the world has surrendered to sleep. But we are awake, staring up at the ceiling, or looking into the cold blue glow of a phone screen. We scroll through the digital landscape of other people's victories. We see the announcements. A friend is celebrating a major promotion. Someone else has just bought a beautiful home. Another is smiling brightly in a wedding photo. And with every image, a quiet, heavy stone settles at the bottom of our chest. We try to be happy for them. We truly do. But beneath the surface, a familiar anxiety begins to whisper. Why am I still here? Why does everyone else seem to be moving forward effortlessly, while my feet are trapped in the mud? We mentally retrace our steps, agonizing over past decisions, wondering if we took a wrong turn 5 years ago that disqualified us from the life we were supposed to have. We look at the calendar and feel a sudden panic, a suffocating dread that our best years are slipping through our fingers like dry sand, and we have absolutely nothing to show for it. In these solitary moments, we often turn our frustration upward. We whisper into the dark, asking God why our timeline feels so broken. We ask why our prayers seem to hit a brass ceiling, returning to us only as empty echoes. And then the guilt sets in. We tell ourselves that if our faith were just a little bit stronger, we would not feel this hollow ache of disappointment. But let us pause right here, in the quiet of this moment. Feeling crushed by the weight of a delayed dream is not a sin. It is a profoundly human experience. God does not sit in the heavens, arms crossed, judging us for being tired of the waiting. He draws intimately near to the broken-hearted. He understands the profound, aching grief of a deferred hope. The book of Proverbs, in the World English Bible, voices this exact pain with breathtaking honesty. It tells us, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when longing is fulfilled, it is a tree of life. Our hearts are simply sick with the waiting, and God sees that sickness not as a lack of faith, but as a wound that needs His gentle binding. Tonight, we are going to step out of this modern race. We are going to leave behind the ticking clocks, the glowing screens, and the crushing societal pressure to have our entire lives figured out by a certain age. We are going to journey back across thousands of years into the arid, sun-baked landscapes of the ancient Near East. We are going back to walk alongside a man who knew the agonizing, suffocating silence of delayed promises better than anyone in history. We are going to walk with a man who spent the absolute prime of his youth, the very years that culture tells us are supposed to be our most vibrant and successful, locked away in the shadows. He was a man who watched over a decade of his life vanish in the dark, forgotten by the world, listening to the slow drip of water in an underground dungeon. He was given a massive, breathtaking promise by God, only to watch every conceivable circumstance violently rip that promise to shreds. For 13 long years, it looked like everyone else had moved on. It looked like his enemies had won. It looked like the world, and perhaps even God himself, had completely passed him by. But in those quiet, hidden spaces where no human eye could see, the great architect of time was doing his most masterful, meticulous work. So tonight, let your shoulders drop. Take a deep, slow breath and let go of the heavy burden of managing your own timeline. Let us journey together to the rugged valleys of Canaan and the vast golden empires of ancient Egypt. Let us find rest in the extraordinary story of Joseph and discover together how God's delays are never, ever His denials. The story of Joseph does not begin in the grand, monument-lined avenues of Egypt, but in the rugged, sun-baked hills of Canaan. Imagine the landscape of the ancient Near East. It is a world dominated by raw elements. The fierce sun beats down upon the limestone ridges, baking the earth until it cracks. The dry desert winds carry the scent of wild thyme, olive wood, and the heavy, earthy smell of massive flocks of sheep. This was the Valley of Hebron, a place where survival required constant labor, calloused hands, and a hardened spirit. In the midst of this harsh, dust-covered world lived a young man who stood out in stark, vibrant contrast. Joseph was 17 years old, the deeply favored son of his father Jacob. We often hear about the coat of many colors, but we must understand what this garment truly represented in the ancient world. It was not merely a colorful piece of clothing. In a culture where people wore rough, undyed wool woven in dull browns and faded grays, Joseph's tunic was a masterpiece of luxury. It was likely a garment with long sleeves reaching down to his ankles, dyed in expensive, vivid hues of crimson, deep indigo, and rich saffron. It was the kind of tunic worn by royalty, by supervisors, by those who were exempt from the back-breaking physical labor of the fields. Every time Joseph walked into the sunlight, that coat was a visual megaphone. It announced to his older brothers that Joseph was the chosen one. He was the heir. He was the future. To compound this, Joseph was a dreamer. He had visions of sheaves of wheat bowing down to his sheaf, and of the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing in submission to him. When he shared these dreams, perhaps with the innocent audacity of youth, he was painting a picture of a magnificent destiny. He was promised a future of leadership and authority. But dreams, especially ones given by God, often agitate the environments around them. For Joseph's older brothers, who spent their days enduring the blistering heat, fighting off predators, and sleeping on the cold, rocky ground, that vibrant coat was not a symbol of God's favor. It was a daily, unbearable reminder of their own secondary status. Jealousy is rarely a sudden explosion. It is a slow, quiet rot. It festers in the shadows of the heart, growing a little more bitter with every perceived slight, until it finally mutates into hatred. The breaking point arrived on a day that began like any other. Joseph was sent by his father to check on his brothers, who were pasturing the flocks miles away in Dothan. Imagine that long, solitary walk. Joseph journeyed over 50 miles across uneven terrain, the vibrant colors of his coat contrasting sharply against the bleached, arid landscape. He was walking directly toward his destiny, completely unaware that his destiny required him to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. From a distance, his brothers saw the flash of colors approaching. And in that moment, the years of silent, simmering resentment boiled over into a deadly consensus. They did not just want to kill their brother. They wanted to kill the dream. The ambush was sudden and violent. Before Joseph could even greet them, rough hands grabbed him. The beautiful long-sleeved tunic was violently torn from his body. We can imagine the sheer panic in his chest, the confusion, the desperate pleas to the men he had known his entire life. But there was no mercy in their eyes. They dragged him to a dry cistern, a deep pit carved directly into the limestone bedrock, designed to catch the winter rains. They cast him down into the dark. Think about the physical reality of that pit. The walls would have been steep, curved, and impossible to climb. The air at the bottom would have been thick, stagnant, and suffocatingly hot. The light of the brilliant Middle Eastern sun was suddenly reduced to a small, distant circle far above his head. The ground beneath him was nothing but dry dust and the terrifying rustle of whatever creatures lurked in the dark. And then, the most chilling detail of the narrative unfolds. As Joseph sat in the suffocating darkness, weeping and begging for his life, his brothers sat down on the ground above him to eat their lunch. How quickly the ground can fall out from beneath us. In our own lives, it might not be a physical pit in a desert, but the emotional shock is exactly the same. One moment we feel secure. We have our plans, our career trajectories, our relationships. We are wearing our own version of the vibrant coat, believing that our future is bright and guaranteed. And then a sudden phone call comes. A company restructures. A betrayal shatters a marriage. A doctor walks into the room with a somber expression. In an instant, the coat is torn away. We are thrown into a dark, disorienting space, looking up at the world continuing on without us. People seemingly eating, drinking, and living their lives while we are trapped in the dark. For Joseph, the nightmare was only beginning. As he sat in the dust, the sound of camel bells drifted through the dry air. A caravan of Ishmaelite merchants was passing through, laden with aromatic spices, balm and myrrh, on their way to the bustling markets of Egypt. Instead of leaving him to die, his brothers hauled him out of the pit. For a fleeting second, Joseph might have thought they had repented, that they were bringing him home. But as he wiped the dust from his eyes, he saw the silver coins trading hands. 20 pieces of silver, the standard market price for a young male slave. In that transaction, Joseph's entire identity was erased. He was no longer the favored son of Jacob. He was no longer the boy with the prophetic dreams. He was reduced to a line item on a merchant's ledger. He was property. Heavy ropes or iron shackles were likely bound to his wrists. As the caravan began to move, Joseph would have been forced to march behind the massive swaying camels. The journey from Canaan to Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula is unforgiving. It is a grueling trek across vast seas of scorching sand, jagged mountains, and relentless, blinding sunlight. With every agonizing step, the hills of his homeland grew smaller in the distance. The physical exhaustion of walking miles upon miles in the desert heat was matched only by the crushing psychological trauma of his reality. Where was God in the dust of that caravan trail? Where were the bowing stars and the sheaves of wheat? As Joseph walked into the terrifying unknown of a foreign empire, surrounded by men speaking a language he could not understand, it must have felt as though his life was over before it had even truly begun. His timeline was not just delayed, it was destroyed. The grueling march across the Sinai desert finally ended, giving way to a landscape that must have felt like another planet to a shepherd boy from Canaan. Egypt was not just another nation, it was the undisputed, colossal superpower of the ancient world. As the caravan descended into the Nile Delta, the arid dust was replaced by the intense, vibrant green of fertile marshlands. Imagine the sensory overload Joseph experienced as he was marched into the heart of the empire. The air was thick with the humidity of the great river and heavy with the scent of lotus flowers, roasting meats, and burning incense. Towering above the palm trees were massive monuments, obelisks and temples carved from solid rock. The Great Pyramids, already ancient even in Joseph's time, gleamed in the distance, encased in blinding white limestone that reflected the fierce Egyptian sun. The streets were a chaotic symphony of chariots clattering over stone, merchants shouting in a harsh, unfamiliar tongue, and the endless movement of soldiers, scribes, and slaves. It was here, in the bustling, merciless slave markets of Egypt, that Joseph was put on display. He was purchased by a man named Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's royal guard. This was a man of immense wealth, military power, and high social standing. When Joseph stepped through the massive gates of Potiphar's estate, he entered a world of staggering opulence. Egyptian villas of the elite were architectural marvels. They featured sprawling, enclosed courtyards with shimmering pools full of lotus blossoms and exotic fish. High walls offered shade from the relentless sun, and the interiors were supported by grand wooden columns painted in vivid reds, blues, and golds. Servants moved silently across cool, polished stone floors. In this luxurious but profoundly alien environment, Joseph was stripped of whatever dignity he had left. He was a foreigner, a captive, placed at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. He was handed a simple, rough linen kilt, the standard uniform of an Egyptian slave. His old life was officially dead. It is right here that many of us would have completely surrendered to bitterness. When our lives are derailed by unfair circumstances, the natural human response is to shut down. We want to cross our arms, curse our fate, and refuse to participate in a life we never asked for. But Joseph did something extraordinary. He engaged with his pain through silent, relentless discipline. He did not wait to be rescued before he decided to be faithful. He began to learn. He trained his ear to understand the complex, rapid syllables of the Egyptian language. He observed the intricate cultural customs, the way the household was managed, the accounting of the grain silos, the management of the vineyards, and the daily rhythms of the estate. He likely started with the most menial, back-breaking chores. He swept the stone floors. He carried the heavy jars of water from the Nile. He tended to the livestock in the intense heat. But with every task, he displayed a quiet, unshakable excellence. The World English Bible tells us a profound detail about this dark chapter. It simply says, Yahweh was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. Even as a slave, God's presence was the defining mark on his life. Potiphar, a man trained to notice details, began to see that everything this young Hebrew touched seemed to flourish. Slowly, steadily, the heavy doors of opportunity began to open again. Joseph was promoted from the fields to the house, then from a house servant to a supervisor. Eventually, Potiphar entrusted him with absolute authority over his entire estate. Joseph managed the finances, the properties, the servants, and the agricultural yields. He wore a new garment now, a tunic signifying his high rank within the captain's household. For the first time in years, Joseph could take a deep breath. He was likely in his early 20s. He had survived the pit, he had survived the desert. He had rebuilt his life from the ashes. It seemed that the terrible delay was finally ending, and he was stepping back into the light of God's favor. But success, much like failure, brings its own dangerous gravitational pull. Joseph was young, handsome, and now held a position of significant power. And he caught the eye of Potiphar's wife. Her pursuit was not a passing glance. It was a daily, relentless campaign of seduction and harassment. She cornered him in the corridors. She whispered demands when the servants were out of earshot. For a slave to deny the master's wife was an incredibly dangerous game, risking severe punishment or death. Yet Joseph stood his ground, bound by a fierce, unyielding integrity to the God who had sustained him and the master who had trusted him. The breaking point arrived on a quiet day when the house was completely empty of servants. She caught him by his garment, demanding he surrender. Joseph knew that engaging in an argument would cost him his soul. So he made a split-second decision. He slipped out of his cloak, leaving it in her hands, and fled out the door into the burning sunlight. He had done the right thing. He had chosen righteousness over compromise. But as he stood outside, breathing heavily, the horrifying realization must have set in. Once again, a garment had been taken from him. Once again, it would be used to craft a devastating lie. When Potiphar returned, The false accusation was delivered with venomous tears. The captain's rage was absolute. The incredible life Joseph had painstakingly rebuilt over years of silent, agonizing labor was shattered in a matter of seconds. The guards seized him. The fine linen of his authority was stripped away. He was dragged away from the beautiful courtyards, away from the sunlight, and thrown down into the suffocating, terrifying darkness of the royal dungeon. He had done everything right, and his reward was a heavier set of chains. The change from the sunlit, vibrant courtyards of Potiphar's mansion to the cold, subterranean darkness of the royal prison was a violent shock to Joseph's senses. This was no ordinary jail. It was the place where the king's prisoners were bound, a fortress of stone carved deep into the earth, designed specifically to break the human spirit. The air here was heavy, thick with the suffocating smell of mildew, stagnant water, and the damp chill of wet limestone that never saw the warmth of the sun. In the winter nights, the cold would seep out of the stone walls, settling deep into Joseph's bones, making sleep an elusive mercy. The soundtrack of his life was no longer the rustle of palm trees or the bustling business of a great estate. It was the low, hollow groans of other forgotten souls, the scurry of rats in the straw, and the sharp, metallic clang of iron chains echoing off the low ceilings. The Book of Psalms, in the World English Bible, remembers the sheer physical agony of this period, telling us of Joseph. They hurt his feet with fetters. He was bound in iron. Imagine the raw physical toll of that captivity. The rough iron cuffs chafed against his skin, creating deep sores that the dusty prison floor only irritated. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological torment of the silence. It is in this subterranean stillness that we find the true battlefield of faith. When Joseph was in the pit in Canaan, it was a sudden crisis. When he was sold to the Ishmaelite merchants, it was a fast-moving trauma. But the royal prison was a completely different kind of trial. It was the trial of endurance. It was the agonizing, slow-motion evaporation of time. Joseph had been 17 years old when his brothers betrayed him. By the time he would finally stand before Pharaoh, he would be 30. A massive portion of those 13 years was spent inside these bleak grey walls. Think about that for a moment. He was watching the absolute prime of his youth. The years when a young person builds their identity, establishes their life, and makes their mark on the world, completely vanish into the dark. Every morning, a faint grey sliver of light would appear through a high, barred window, crawl slowly across the stone floor, and disappear. Another day gone, another month dissolved, another year stolen. And for what? For doing the right thing, for choosing purity and integrity over compromise. This is the exact place where the enemy of our souls loves to whisper his most destructive lies. As Joseph sat in the damp dark, staring at the walls, the whispers must have come. Where is your God now? Where are those grand dreams of the sun and moon bowing down to you? Look at your brothers back in Canaan. They are married, they have children, they are building their wealth, while you are rotting in an Egyptian hole. You trusted God, and look where it got you. How deeply we understand those whispers. Many of us are living in our own version of that royal prison tonight. It is not made of ancient Egyptian stone, but the walls are just as real, and the sense of being completely trapped is just as suffocating. We find ourselves stuck in a career path that feels like a dead end, forced to work survival jobs just to pay the rent, while we watch our former classmates climb the corporate ladder, collect accolades, and post about their dream lives. We find ourselves trapped in the exhausting loop of a chronic illness, spending our days navigating doctor appointments, medical bills, and physical pain, watching the world move vibrant and fast outside our window while our lives feel completely frozen. We find ourselves sitting in the quiet of an empty house year after year, praying for a companion, praying for a family, watching the biological clock tick forward, feeling a terrifying sense of grief for a life we feel we are missing out on. In these long, drawn-out seasons of delay, the hardest part is not the hardship itself. It is the feeling that our time is being wasted. We feel as though we are falling behind in a race where everyone else was given a head start. We look at the calendar with a tightening in our throat, terrified that our best years are being poured into a void and that we will never catch up. We ask God, why the silence? If you love me, why am I still here? But let us breathe in this truth tightly tonight. The dark spaces of our lives are never a sign that God has abandoned us. The prison was not the destination. It was the hidden workshop. Joseph could not see it through the tears and the gloom, but the heavy iron chains around his ankles were not just binding him. They were holding him in the exact geographic and historical coordinates where his greatest purpose would soon be unleashed. Even in the suffocating darkness of the royal dungeon, Joseph refused to let his spirit harden into bitterness. The same quiet, relentless discipline that he had shown in Potiphar's fields, he now applied to the prison. He organized, he managed, and he served. Over time, the keeper of the prison saw the undeniable presence of God on this young Hebrew and committed all the other prisoners into his hand. Joseph was now running a dungeon from the inside. Into this bleak underground world arrived two new inmates. But these were no ordinary men. They were the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of the king of Egypt. These men had recently stood in the magnificent halls of the palace, wearing fine linen, breathing in the scent of myrrh and frankincense, holding the literal life of Pharaoh in their hands. Now they were stripped of their honors and thrust into the damp, lightless reality of the prison. One morning, as Joseph was making his rounds, he noticed a heavy, oppressive silence in their cell. Despite carrying the immense, crushing weight of his own trauma and his own delayed dreams, Joseph still had the profound empathy to look at these men and ask why their faces were so sad. They had both experienced vivid, terrifying dreams, and in the ancient world, a dream without an interpretation was considered a terrible omen. Joseph, leaning on the wisdom of God, listened. For the chief cupbearer, the dream was a magnificent promise. A vine with 3 branches blossomed and brought forth grapes, which he squeezed into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph looked at the disgraced official and delivered the breathtaking news. In 3 days, Pharaoh would lift up his head and restore him to his royal position. He was going back to the palace. He was going back to the light. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Joseph saw a massive, undeniable door of hope swing open. He leaned in, and with the desperate vulnerability of a man who had lost everything, he made a single, agonizingly simple request. The World English Bible captures his plea perfectly. Joseph said, "But remember me when it is well with you. Please show kindness to me, and make mention of me to Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed, I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon." It was a perfect plan. This was the strategy. The cupbearer would go back, whisper in Pharaoh's ear, and Joseph would finally be set free. The 3rd day arrived. It was Pharaoh's birthday. We can imagine the heavy iron door of the dungeon groaning open, letting in a sudden blinding shaft of sunlight. The royal guards marched down the stone steps. They unlocked the chains binding the cupbearer. They pulled him out of the shadows, washing away the grime of the prison, preparing him to return to the king's side. As the iron door slammed shut, leaving Joseph back in the dim grey light, his heart must have been racing with anticipation. The nightmare was finally ending. He likely sat on the cold floor, listening closely to every sound echoing down the stone corridor. He waited for the sound of boots. He waited for the rattle of keys. He waited for the royal decree that would open his cell. Day 1 passed. The faint light shifted across the floor and faded into absolute black. Day 2 passed.
A week went by.
Then a month. We can imagine Joseph standing near the small barred window, straining to hear any whisper of his name from the guards above. Every time a footstep echoed in the hall, his breath must have caught in his throat. Is this it? Is it today? But the footsteps always faded away. The terrifying, heart-shattering reality began to set in. The final verse of Genesis chapter 40 delivers one of the most painful, devastating sentences in all of Scripture. Yet the chief cupbearer didn't remember Joseph, but forgot him. He forgot him. The man who had looked into Joseph's eyes, the man whose life Joseph had essentially comforted and prophesied over, walked out into the sunlight, took a sip of fine wine, and completely erased the Hebrew prisoner from his memory. How intensely we feel the sting of this specific kind of pain. We know exactly what it is like to pin our desperate hopes on a human solution. We have all experienced the exhaustion of waiting for someone else to open a door for us. We pour our energy into a company, believing they will reward our loyalty, only to be passed over for a promotion by someone who barely knows the job. We support a friend through their darkest hour, carrying their burdens, only to watch them walk into a season of massive success and suddenly become too busy to return our calls. We send out the resumes, we make the connections, we plead our case, and we are met with an agonizing, deafening silence. For Joseph, that silence lasted for 2 full years, 730 days in the dark, 730 nights of staring at the ceiling, fighting the terrifying thought that God had simply looked away. When we read 2 full years, we say it in a second, but to live it is a slow psychological torture. It is the agonizing death of human effort. It is the realization that no amount of networking, no amount of perfect behavior, and no amount of sheer willpower can force the hand of the clock forward when God has decreed that it is time to wait. Why does God allow the silence to stretch on for so long? When we are sitting in the ashes of our own plans, exhausted and broken, this is the question that haunts us the most. It feels incredibly cruel to be left in the dark when we know that God has the power to simply speak a word and shatter our chains. We wonder if we have done something wrong, if we are being punished, or if we have somehow drifted so far off course that God has simply given up on our story. But tonight, let us step back from the crushing anxiety of our immediate circumstances. Let us look at the vast, sweeping architecture of God's providence. What if the cupbearer had remembered Joseph the very next morning? What if he had immediately spoken to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh had granted Joseph a full pardon? It is exactly what Joseph prayed for. It is what we would have prayed for. He would have walked out of the prison a free man. But then what? He would have been a penniless, undocumented Hebrew ex-slave wandering the streets of an Egyptian metropolis. With no family, no wealth, and no status, his deepest, most urgent instinct would have been to go home. He would have likely joined the first caravan heading east, walking back across the scorching sands of the Sinai, back to the dusty hills of Canaan, back to the father who loved him. He would have been safe. He would have been free. But if Joseph had gone back to Canaan, he would have been sitting in a shepherd's tent when the most catastrophic global famine in ancient history swept across the earth just a few years later. Without the grain silos of Egypt, the entire region would have starved. Joseph would have perished in the dust. His brothers would have perished. The entire lineage of Israel, the very family line that would eventually bring forth the Savior of the world, would have been completely wiped out. The terrifying reality is that Joseph's answered prayer would have been his absolute destruction. The delay was not a punishment. It was a divine anchor. The heavy iron chains of the Egyptian dungeon were literally holding Joseph in the exact geographic and historical coordinates where he needed to be. God was hiding him in the dark to protect him from a famine he could not yet see. How often do we mourn the closed doors in our own lives without realizing they are actually shields of mercy? We cry over the job we desperately wanted but did not get. We agonize over the relationship we begged God to save, only to watch it slip away. We feel a profound, aching grief over the timeline that has been shattered. But we do not have the vantage point of eternity. We cannot see the unseen dangers, the toxic environments, or the devastating famines that God is mercifully keeping us away from by simply telling us to wait. We must gently remind ourselves tonight that God's delay is not God's denial. The waiting room of God is never empty of purpose. While we are obsessively calculating the speed of our journey, God is intimately concerned with the depth of our character. In the dark, stripped of his vibrant coat, stripped of his status in Potiphar's house, and stripped of his reliance on human connections, Joseph was being beautifully and painfully remade. He was learning to lean his entire weight upon the unseen God. He was being hollowed out so that he could carry a heavier weight of glory. The prison was not his tomb. It was an incubator. The book of Ecclesiastes in the World English Bible offers a profound comfort for these hidden seasons. It whispers to our anxious hearts, "He has made everything beautiful in its time." Not in our time, not on the schedule we so desperately try to force, but in His perfect, masterful time. If you are listening to this right now, and you feel entirely forgotten, if you feel as though you have been passed over by life, and your most vibrant years are being wasted in a holding pattern, please hear this truth. Your hidden years are not wasted years. Every moment spent in the dark, wrestling with your faith, choosing to trust God when nothing makes sense, is doing a profound work in your soul. You are not falling behind. You are being prepared. God is quietly setting the stage. He is moving pieces on the board that you cannot see. And just like Joseph, who went to sleep on an ordinary night in a dark cell, completely unaware that his entire universe was about to change, your breakthrough is being woven together in the silence. The long night is necessary, but the night will not last forever. 2 full years of absolute stillness had passed over Joseph's head. But while the earth was quiet, the heavens were orchestrating a sudden, cataclysmic shift. The turning point arrived not in the slow, agonizing crawl of human effort, but in the middle of a single, ordinary night in the grand royal palace of Egypt. Pharaoh, the absolute ruler of the civilized world, a man considered a living god by millions, lay tossing and turning on his luxurious bed of ebony and gold. The fine linen sheets and the cooling breeze from the Nile could not soothe his agitated mind. He was trapped in the grip of 2 vivid, terrifying nightmares. In his dream, he stood by the banks of the sacred Nile River, the lifeblood of the entire empire. Suddenly, out of the shimmering waters came 7 sleek, fat, beautiful cows, grazing peacefully in the reed grass. But then, the water churned again, and out stepped 7 gaunt, skeletal, sickly cows. In a horrifying defiance of nature, The starving, hollow-eyed beasts fell upon the fat cows and swallowed them whole. Yet, after devouring them, they remained just as gaunt and miserable as before. Pharaoh awoke, his heart pounding in his chest, only to fall back into sleep and see 7 rich, plump ears of grain growing on a single stalk, suddenly devoured by 7 withered, wind-blasted, empty ears. When morning broke, the palace was thrown into a state of absolute panic. The emperor's spirit was deeply troubled. He summoned every magician, every wise man, every highly trained priest, and every master of the occult within the borders of the empire. Imagine the scene in the grand audience hall. Scribes unrolled ancient, dusty papyrus scrolls of dream interpretation. Wise men debated in hushed, frantic whispers. But as the hours ticked away, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the court. Not a single person in the entire intellectual superpower of Egypt could decipher the dreams. The king's frustration was turning into dangerous rage. It was in that precise moment of human helplessness that the divine alignment locked into place. The chief cupbearer, standing near the throne with his golden pitcher, felt a sudden sharp jolt of memory. The face of the Hebrew prisoner he had abandoned 2 years ago flashed vividly before his eyes. He stepped forward, his voice trembling as he addressed the sovereign. In Genesis chapter 41, the world expresses his confession. "I remember my faults today." He proceeded to tell Pharaoh about the young man in the royal prison who had interpreted his own dream with flawless, breathtaking accuracy. The command from Pharaoh was instantaneous and absolute. "Bring him." Imagine the sudden explosion of activity at the gates of the royal dungeon. For 13 years, Joseph had adjusted to the slow, heavy rhythm of captivity. But on this morning, the heavy iron doors did not just groan open. They were flung wide with frantic urgency. Royal messengers and guards rushed down the stone steps, their boots echoing loudly in the damp corridors. They bypassed the cells, stopped directly in front of Joseph, and unlocked his chains. There was no time to waste. According to strict Egyptian court etiquette, no one could stand before the presence of the divine king looking unkempt. The guards worked with feverish speed. They brought in razors, shaving Joseph's head, and the thick, heavy beard he had grown during his years in the dark, transforming him into the clean-shaven appearance of an Egyptian bureaucrat. They stripped away the tattered, stained linen of the prison that he had worn for years. They washed away the dust, the sweat, and the very scent of the dungeon from his skin. They anointed him with sweet-smelling oils and dressed him in garments of pure, crisp, brilliant white linen. Think about the sheer sensory whiplash of that hour. One moment, Joseph was sitting in the dim, damp, forgotten corners of the earth, smelling of mildew and iron. The next moment, he was being marched through the towering, sun-drenched pillars of the royal palace, his eyes adjusting to the blinding, magnificent light of the Egyptian court. The walls around him were covered in shimmering gold leaf, vibrant hieroglyphics, and massive statues of polished granite. He was brought to stand before the throne. Pharaoh looked down at this young Hebrew, whose life had been completely erased by society, and said, "I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you, that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." This was Joseph's moment. If he had been operating in his own human strength, he might have used this opportunity to brag, to market himself, or to bargain for his freedom. But the 13 years in the furnace of affliction had done their work. Joseph was completely empty of pride and completely full of God. He looked directly into the eyes of the most powerful man on earth and answered with quiet, unshakable humility, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." With the wisdom of the Holy Spirit, Joseph listened as Pharaoh repeated the dreams. And then, without a single moment of hesitation, Joseph unfolded the future. He explained that the two dreams were one and the same. God was showing Pharaoh what he was about to do. 7 years of unprecedented, staggering abundance were coming to the land of Egypt, but they would be immediately followed by 7 years of a catastrophic, merciless famine that would completely consume the land, making the previous abundance forgotten. Joseph did not just interpret the problem, he provided the divine strategy. He told Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee the land, to build massive storehouses during the years of plenty, and to gather a fifth of the harvest so that the nation and the world would survive the coming darkness. As Joseph spoke, a profound shift took place in the room. The atmosphere of panic dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming sense of divine authority. Pharaoh looked at his ministers, his generals, and his wise men, and then turned his gaze back to the young man who had been a prisoner just an hour before. In Genesis chapter 41, the World English Bible records Pharaoh's sudden, historic realization. Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Pharaoh stood up from his throne. The entire court held its breath. He looked at Joseph and declared, "Because God has shown you all of this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in the throne will I be greater than you." The transformation was absolute, immediate, and breathtaking. Pharaoh took the signet ring from his own finger, the ultimate symbol of imperial authority, and placed it on Joseph's hand. He commanded his servants to clothe Joseph in vestures of fine royal linen and placed a heavy, glittering chain of pure gold around his neck, a neck that had borne the heavy iron collar of a slave. He made him ride in the second chariot of the empire, and as the procession moved through the crowded streets of the capital, royal heralds ran before him, shouting to the masses, "Bow the knee!" 13 years of slavery and imprisonment dissolved in a single day. Joseph had gone to sleep the night before as a forgotten number in a dark cellar. He went to sleep that night as the Grand Vizier of Egypt, the second most powerful human being on the surface of the earth. Let this truth wash over your exhausted heart tonight. Our lives can change in a single, sudden moment when the timing of God aligns with His purpose. We spend years weeping in the dark, feeling as though we are standing still, watching everyone else move ahead. We think the delay is permanent. But the reality is that God does not need decades to vindicate us. He does not need years to open the floodgates of His blessing. He can move a mountain in a heartbeat. He can turn a prison into a palace in the span of a single conversation. The 13 years Joseph spent waiting were not a waste of time. They were the exact amount of time required to build the character necessary to carry the weight of the ring, the linen, and the chariot without losing his soul. If he had been promoted at 17, his pride would have destroyed him. God waited until he was ready, and when the moment came, the elevation was seamless, permanent, and glorious. Your hidden years are simply the deep foundation being poured for a structure that will stand the test of time. Trust the hand that is preparing you in the dark, for the dawn is closer than you think. Let us gently leave the sun-drenched streets of ancient Egypt. The crowds have faded, the golden chariots have passed. We are returning now across the vast expanse of time, coming back to the quiet sanctuary of this very moment. Come back to the stillness of your room. Listen to the silence around you. It is no longer the terrifying silence of a forgotten dungeon, but the peaceful, sacred quiet of a resting place. Think about the beautiful conclusion of Joseph's story. Years later, looking into the eyes of the very brothers who threw him into the pit, who initiated that agonizing 13-year delay. Joseph did not speak with bitterness. He did not demand an apology or seek revenge. He spoke with the quiet, profound peace of a man who finally understood the magnificent architecture of his own life. In Genesis chapter 50, the World English Bible records his breathtaking, healing realization. He said to them, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save many people alive." God meant it for good. Every delay, every closed door, every tear shed in the dark, every single moment you felt entirely left behind. God was weaving it all into a tapestry of breathtaking goodness. The enemy of your soul may have meant your current struggles to break you, to exhaust you, and to make you question the love of your Creator. But God is taking those exact same circumstances and using them to protect you, to prepare you, and to position you for a future that is far more beautiful than the one you have been desperately trying to build on your own. So tonight, it is time to lay down your armor. You do not need to fight the clock anymore. You do not need to figure out the next 10 years of your life before the sun comes up. Notice the physical tension you are carrying in your body right now. Notice how tightly you are holding your jaw. Notice how your shoulders are raised, bracing for the next disappointment, holding the heavy weight of a world you were never meant to carry. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose, filling your lungs with the quiet peace of this moment. And slowly exhale. Let it all go. Drop your shoulders, unclench your hands, sink deeply into the mattress beneath you. Imagine taking that heavy, ticking clock of societal expectations, the loud, demanding timeline that says you must be at a certain place by a certain age, and gently handing it over to the God who created time itself. He is not rushing you. He is not disappointed in your pace. He is simply holding you. Let go of the comparisons. Let go of the exhausting need to understand why someone else's breakthrough happened before yours. Their story is not your story. God has written a completely unique, masterful narrative for your life, and it does not require you to compete with anyone else. You are exactly where you need to be tonight. Let us pray together as we prepare to surrender to sleep. Gracious and loving Father, we come to you in the quietness of this night, carrying the heavy exhaustion of our delayed dreams. We confess that we have been so tired from trying to force doors open that were meant to stay closed. We have let the anxiety of falling behind steal our joy and our peace. Tonight, we ask for the profound grace to simply be still. Thank you for the beautiful reminder of your servant Joseph. Thank you for proving that even when we are hidden in the dark, we are never hidden from your sight. Forgive us for the moments we doubted your goodness in the waiting. We ask that you would gently heal the ache of our deferred hopes. Bind up the wounds of our disappointment. As we close our eyes tonight, we deliberately hand over our careers, our relationships, our finances, and our unseen tomorrows into your capable, loving hands. We choose to believe that you are working in the silent, unseen spaces of our lives. We ask that you would blanket this room with your absolute peace. Guard our minds against the whispers of the enemy. Silence the loud anxieties of the world. Grant us a deep, restorative, and dreamless sleep. Let our physical bodies heal as our souls find total rest in the certainty of your unending love. We do not need to know what tomorrow holds, because we know exactly who holds tomorrow. We rest securely in you. In your holy and precious name we pray. Amen. Rest now. The waiting is not wasted. You are deeply loved, profoundly seen, and safely held. Sleep in peace.